Thank you very much, Jonathan, for that introduction. Thank you very much, Alex, for your great help in putting this all together over the last few months. Thank you all so much for being here. I thought there would be 3 people. Jacob Dinezon. Who's ever heard of Jacob Dinezon? And as Jonathan said, if you go to that cemetery and you look at that great mausoleum, that monument to the 3 writers, and people say, wow, you know, I recognize Peretz. He was the great short story writer and the playwright and the poet. And, you know, then there's Ansky, who wrote that wonderful play, The Dybbuk, right, about the rejected bridegroom who possesses the bride, right? And all of the stuff that goes on with that. And then there's the name in the middle, Dinezon. And people go, who is that? Well, I'm going to try to make a case to you today that he was an essential part of the development of modern Yiddish literature in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and that he deserves to be remembered. And he especially deserves to be remembered today, because today, on the Hebrew calendar, this is the exact day of his 100th Yahrzeit. So the 3rd of Elul is the 100th anniversary of Jacob Dinezon's Yahrzeit. So I hope for you that you will find surprises in this talk that you didn't expect. That it's not just about finding out about an author you didn't know about, but the connections this writer had with all of the rest of the really great writers that we think about as the, you know, people who developed modern Yiddish literature. No, I thank you for introducing Tina Lunson. Tina Lunson is the translator of 2 of our major publications, Jacob Dinezon's Memories and Scenes, which is a short story collection. I'll tell you about that in a moment, and also The Dark Young Man, which was published this year. This is the first English translation of Jacob Dinezon's best-selling 1877 novel, and I'll talk with you a little more about that as well. And again, Sheva Zucker, in addition to being all of those things, she used to reside in Raleigh, North Carolina, where I still live. I know, don't tell people. I know, it's like being in Siberia, you know, and she's been released. But at any rate, it's so wonderful to have you here, both of you here for this as well. So let me say that the 3rd of Elul, 5779, is the celebration, the 100th Yahrzeit of Jacob Dinezon. And we did have the opportunity just 6 days ago to be in Warsaw in front of that monument and to be able to attend a service. It's interesting, August 29th was the Yahrzeit on the secular calendar, and so my family and I had the opportunity to participate in a commemorative service held in Warsaw at the Jewish cemetery, where Dinezon is buried in that grand mausoleum with his friends Ayel Peretz and Shin Ansky, S. Ansky. It's so hard, you know. You want to use the Hebrew letters, but when you see it in English, it's you know, S versus the Shin, I versus the Yud. So if I get it confused, you'll forgive me a little bit. At least this audience will understand that, okay? So this is what it looks like on that mausoleum with the 3 names. And as Jonathan said, a lot of people will go through and they'll look at Peretz and they'll look at Ansky down at the bottom, and there you have Jacob Dinezon. And so this trip to Warsaw was really the culmination of a 16-year journey to try to find out who Jacob Dinezon was, and to, in the end, kind of help restore him to his rightful place in the development of modern Yiddish literature. Now, for most of us, these are the 3 writers who come to mind when we think of modern Yiddish literature, right? Sholem Abramovich, who used the pen name Mendele Mocher Sforim when he wrote in Yiddish. Ayel Peretz, and Sholem Aleichem. They are often called the Klassikers, the classic writers of modern Yiddish literature. And it was while I was doing research on these three writers that I first began noticing another name popping up here and there, a name I had never heard before, Jacob Dinezon. And what was so strange, the English spelling of the name kept changing. Now in Yiddish, the spelling is always the same, Dinezon. But in transliteration, look at all the variations. It's like Hanukkah, right? The 15 spellings of Hanukkah, right? Of course, Dinezon's name in English, we decided to use the Yivo spelling to try to bring some order to the chaos. But, you know, in terms of, you can get the idea, in terms of researching this man, especially today, you know, in our Google search mentality, you know, you put in a spelling and you get 10 or whatever number of hits. Well, you have to do that same thing over and over and over again with each spelling. And as more things get digitized over time, you can't just use one name. And this is going to, I'll show this to you in a moment because it was quite surprising. And the thing that I found out about Jacob Dinezon early on is that whenever people mentioned Jacob Dinezon, it was always in relationship to Ayel Peretz, almost always in relationship to Ayel Peretz. So this is from a memoir by Y.Y. Trunk about his first visit to Peretz's apartment in Warsaw. Peretz led me into his study, a dwarfish, gray-haired man and gray-bearded sat at the desk, absorbed in rolling cigarettes. "This is Jacob Dinezon," Peretz said. "Get acquainted." Dinezon turned around to inspect me. To him, I was a new face, a young man in a long black coat. As for me, it was with great awe that I looked at him. This gray, dwarfish man was the famous author of The Dark Young Man and Yosela, a book over which I had wept a sea of tears. My mother had wailed aloud over it, and even my hard-hearted grandfather had broken into sobs and groped for a cane to beat up Beryl, the cruel Malamed. Then I found this in a memoir by A. McDoney. Older writers used to avoid Peretz. Jacob Dinezon was the outstanding exception. Yet there was something poignantly tragic about the friendship between these two men. The bold facts of the case are that Dinezon's fellowship with Peretz meant the end of his career as a writer. His literary aspirations now merged with or became subservient to those of Peretz. Yet before the flowering of this friendship, Dinezon had been a writer of considerable talent, with an individuality all his own, and an assured place in Yiddish literature. An assured place in Yiddish literature. There was another complication. Almost all of the really important biographical information was in Yiddish. And sadly, even though I had an opportunity as a young person to learn Yiddish, I didn't do a very good job. And so I don't read Yiddish. But what little I could find in Jewish literary histories written in English was astonishing. For instance, in the second half of the 19th century, Jacob Dinezon was a very successful Yiddish novelist. His The Dark Young Man, Der Schwarzer Jungermannschick, is considered the first best-selling novel in Yiddish. It's also considered the first realistic Jewish romance. And Dinezon not only had a close relationship with Ayel Peretz, he also had a long and enduring friendship with Sholem Aleichem. I love this picture. I have to tell you, this was a find on eBay, a collection of Sholem Aleichem pictures, and right in the back in the corner I see someone that looks a little bit like Jacob Dinezon. So I buy the whole collection, and I couldn't wait till it came in, and I'm going through all the things, you know, his funeral, his family, all of that, and there's this picture, Sholem Aleichem sitting next to Jacob Dinezon. That friendship began in 1888. It wasn't 1988, it was 1888, when Sholem Aleichem and his wife Olga paid a visit to Jacob Dinezon's small apartment in Warsaw. Sholem Aleichem was on the verge of publishing a literary anthology in Yiddish, and he came to seek Dinezon's advice, his business advice, and to acquire a story for the first volume. Dinezon would contribute a story. The story title was Go Eat Kreplach. It was about this very, very pious woman who, instead of cursing, would use "go eat kreplach" as her way to avoid the bad words. So "Go Eat Kreplach" was this story contributed to the first volume of Sholem Aleichem's anthology. 2 years later, Dinezon cemented his friendship with Ayel Peretz when he published out of his own pocket Peretz's first book of Yiddish stories, his first book of Yiddish short stories. Once the books were printed, Dinezon wrapped up the whole lot and shipped them off to Peretz for him to use to promote his work. So as I started to connect the dots, I became more and more curious about this Yiddish writer named Jacob Dinezon. Why hadn't anybody spoken of him before? Why was he so unknown today? And so I went looking for stories by Jacob Dinezon, and I couldn't find any because none of them had been translated into English. Now, that could have been the end of the story right there and then. But a friend in Raleigh, Kathleen Southern, made a discovery. Jacob Dinezon's book, Zechroinus und Bilder, Shtetl Kinder Jorn Schreibers, Memories and Scenes, Shtetl Childhood Writers. And from the title and what little I could find out about it at the time, I thought it was an autobiography. And I thought, well, if I could read his autobiography, perhaps that would answer all the questions I was carrying around. And so I thought this would really satisfy my curiosity. Well, to make a long story short, I found a copy of the Yiddish book at the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts. And then I hired a translator. I commissioned Tina Lunson to translate Jacob Dinezon's book into English. Well, we quickly discovered that Memories and Scenes was not an autobiography. In fact, it turned out to be a collection of short stories, some of which were autobiographical in nature. The collection had been published between 1928 and 1929 as part of a multi-volume set honoring Dinezon's 10th Yahrzeit. Although Memories and Scenes was not an autobiography, Dinezon's short stories were similar in content and theme to the stories of Ayel Peretz and Sholem Aleichem. But there was a difference. Dinezon's stories had an emotional quality to them. They could bring a tear to your eye. I would learn later that evoking tears was a Dinezon specialty. I can also say that Dinezon included enough personal details in his stories to fan the flames of my curiosity. So, With the encouragement and support of my sister Robin Evans and her husband Jim, my brother-in-law Jim, I always say this, I like to say this. He probably has heard this so many times. If you read The Dark Young Man, you find a brother-in-law that you don't want to have anything to do with. And my brother-in-law, Jim Evans, has just been fantastic. So, and my sweet companion, Carolyn Tobin. So we have all been, as I think Robin coined this, maybe Jim did, on the Dinezon Express. You know, we've been just following this train wherever it takes us. Not to mention a really wonderful long list of Yiddish translators. We set out to find everything we could about Jacob Dinezon and to bring some of his works into the 21st century. Here are a few highlights. This is a census from Zager, Lithuania. Jacob Dinezon was born in New Zager, in the Kovno region of Lithuania in 1851. Here we have the name listed in the Zager census dated 1858, Yankel Eliash Dinezon. Notice the spelling, D-I-N-E-R-Z-U-N. It's the first time I've seen this. This information, which was uncovered just this year by 3 international members of the online user group Jewish Gen, lays to rest a dispute about Dinezon's birth year. Even though at the time of his death, Yiddish newspapers and publications reported Dinezon's birth year as 1851, most biographical entries list the year as 1856. And what's even more troubling is the mausoleum in the Okapova Street Cemetery has 1858 etched into it. Oy. My rabbi says, never trust the stonecutter. We also learned from this census that Dinezon's parents were named Benjamin and Pessy, and that he had 3 sisters. From Memories and Scenes, we learned that Dinezon's father traveled for business, and his mother was a very pious and loving woman. We also learned that Dinezon appeared destined to be a writer from a very young age. Many years later, in a letter to the Yiddish literary historian Shmuel Niger, Dinezon offers this insight into his earliest writings. I began to write when I was barely 10 years old. Why I wrote, I don't exactly know. But for as long as I can remember, everything that would move another to cry out, to speak, to complain, or even to laugh, moved me to take the pen in hand and write, until my awakening heart spent itself and became peaceful. Now, around 1862 or 1863, just before his 12th birthday, Dinezon's life was suddenly upended by the death of his father. His mother, now left with 4 mouths to feed on her own, makes the difficult decision to send her only son to live with his uncle, Isaac Eliashev, in the Russian city of Mohilev on the Dnieper River, 400 miles away. Jacob Dinezon was now an orphan, because in those days you were considered an orphan if you lost just one parent. And although he was going to live with a caring and generous family member, we can only imagine how being separated from his loving mother and devoted sisters affected this small, young, bright, and sensitive boy. We will see that the plight of orphans becomes a central theme in Dinezon's writings and will emerge again at the end of his life in his community service. Under the guidance of Uncle Eliashev, an observant Jew who also had an interest in secular subjects, Dinezon is enrolled in a yeshiva. And as he grows older, he becomes aware of the Enlightenment ideas that are starting to circulate among the young people of Mohilev. The journalist and critic S.L. Citron,
who includes Dinezon in his memoir, Three Literary Generations, tells us that Dinezon felt a strong desire to help uplift and educate the poor and less fortunate. To this end, he volunteers to teach in a Talmud Torah, a community school for poor boys. Citron writes, they were not just teachers to the children, but faithful fathers who also provided for their physical and material needs, including food, drink, and suitable beds for the night. Now, at about this time, Dinezon is invited to become a tutor in the home of one of the wealthiest Jewish merchants in Mohilev, Yeshua Menachem Hurovich. Citron suggests that Hurovich's wife, Badana, had heard very good things about Jacob Dinezon, his mastery of the Hebrew language, his self-sacrificing work in the Talmud Torah, and his kind and caring nature. In need of a Hebrew teacher for her children, Badana Hurovich offers Jacob Dinezon a job as a live-in tutor. And what a job it must have been! Because for the Jewish young people in Mohilev, the Hurovich's household was at the center of the city's social and cultural scene. Badana had 5 sons and 1 daughter, and it was in the Hurovich's house that they and their friends gathered together to discuss life, literature, politics, and social issues. Some of the participants were struggling with difficult personal problems Dinezon would later weave into his novels. Before long, Dinezon's intelligence, wise counsel, and gentle demeanor so endears him to the Hurovich family that Yeshua Menachem promotes him to bookkeeper and ultimately to manager of the family business. But alas, a dark cloud appears over Dinezon's bright future and bright horizon. According to Citron, Dinezon falls in love with the Hurovich's daughter. Now, it must be said that Citron is the only one who relates this story. There's no way to verify it. Dinezon never talked about it, and biographers who refer to it are dependent on Citron's veracity. But if it's true, it gives us some important insights into Dinezon's later life and the content of his literary works. Because according to Citron, even though Jacob Dinezon fell madly in love with his student, he never said a word to her or her parents. Whether it was due to his shyness, his lack of confidence, or probably more in keeping with his nature, his integrity and strict moral code as a teacher, he never declared his love to the young woman or her family. And to add insult to injury, when the Hurovich's daughter was finally of marriageable age, the family assigned Dinezon the task of traveling to Vilna to arrange her marriage to another man. Here's how Citron ends his chapter. Coming back from Vilna, Dinezon fell sick and did not leave his bed for 3 weeks. The city of Vilna plays an important role in Dinezon's early career as a writer. It's in Vilna, on Hurovich family business, that Dinezon meets Badana's sister, Dvora Ram. You've heard the expression, it's who you know? Well, Dvora Ram, in partnership with her brothers-in-law, owns a major Jewish publishing company noted for the quality of their religious texts. Through this publishing company, Dinezon is introduced to one of Vilna's leading Yiddish authors, Isaac Mayer Dick. Dick takes Dinezon under his wing and introduces him to the other prominent writers in Vilna. And at some point, Dinezon shares 2 of his Yiddish manuscripts with the elder author. Dick is very impressed with Dinezon's writing, and he recommends one of the manuscripts to the Rom Publishing Company. But it's not The Dark Young Man. Dinezon explains this in his letter to Shmuel Niger. The first work I wrote with publication in mind carried the name For the Sins of the Fathers, or A Mirror for Jewish Women, Shopkeepers, and Tavern Keepers. The publisher's widow and brothers Rom only bought fathers from me. They accepted The Dark Young Man simply as a supplement to fathers, but not for publication. The Rom publishing manager tells Dinezon that he will keep the manuscript of The Dark Young Man in the printer's vault until perhaps in some future happy hour it will be rediscovered and found worthy of publishing. Rom pays Dinezon 23 rubles and moves forward with The Sins of the Fathers, a tragic tale about a sensitive young woman who is forced into an arranged marriage with a coarse and despicable man. Although she is in deep distress, the young woman, instead of running off to escape the situation as her friends suggest, gives in to her parents and marries the scoundrel. Her hope, she tells her friends, is that she can educate and reform him. But, of course, what happens? The marriage becomes untenable, and the young woman takes her life. A story very much in keeping with the real-life conflicts Dinezon was hearing about in Moalev. In fact, that was the problem for the novel, because when the Rom Publishing Company submitted the manuscript to the Russian censor, he rejected it. Some believe the censor knew the family in Moalev on which the story was based, and in order to protect their good family name, refused to authorize the book's publication. The manuscript was confiscated and lost forever. So what do you do if you're a publisher? In order not to lose their 23 rubles, their investment of 23 rubles, right? The Rom Publishing pulls the manuscript of The Dark Young Man out of the vault. They present it to the censor. This story is approved, and the novel is published in the fall of 1877. The title is in two parts, Hebrew and Yiddish. Dinezon did this for his first three novels. The first part would be in Hebrew, and the second part would be in Yiddish, as if to give it more weight by having some sort of biblical or Talmudic quote at the beginning of it. And so this title is Ha-ni Iavim Viha-ni Imim oder der Schwarzer Junger Manchik, the beloved and pleasing, or the dark young man. And to everyone's surprise, including the author himself, the book becomes a runaway bestseller. The first 10,000 copies sell out quickly, and several additional printings follow. Now, why was this book so popular? First, it was a love story. Two innocent lovers being threatened by a despicable villain. Second, it was contemporary. It wasn't based on a Bible story, fable, or legend. Dinezon's main characters are modern Jews living in a modern city in the Russian Empire in the mid-1840s. They are struggling with real-life issues and coping with real-life challenges. And there is something more. Dinezon has an uncanny ability to tap the Jewish heart, and by so doing elicits copious tears from his readers. From early in his career as a writer, Dinezon understood the power of tears to console the Jewish heart and the Jewish soul. In every place and in all times, he writes in Memories and Scenes, the Jewish heart is filled with troubles. One just needs to know the right word or touching melody, and the thick ice that forms around the Jewish heart by cold life breaks open, and tears pour out. And out they poured. The Yiddish editor Nachman Meisel says, there was hardly a Jewish home where all the members of the family, old and young, male and female, had not read the novel and shed hot tears of sympathy for the sufferings of the unfortunate Yosef, Rosa, and Ruchama, while the name of the evil young man, Mesha Schneer, became the byword for hypocrisy, cruelty, and murder. Now, with the huge success of The Dark Young Man, one would think that Dinezon was well on the road to stardom. He even had another novel waiting in the wings. But then, out of the blue, he pulls the plug on his own success. Years later, he explains his reasons to Shmuel Niger. I believe you have more or less the idea concerning the success of The Dark Young Man. It was almost that same year I finished my novel, A Stumbling Stone in the Road. However, I had no desire to publish it due to the dead silence of the collective Hebrew language press regarding The Dark Young Man. Despite the fact that tens of thousands of copies were sold, and there was almost no Jewish household in which it had not been read. The Hebrew press that Dinezon writes about is the Jewish Enlightenment press, and those editors and publishers who he so wanted to impress. Unfortunately, they completely ignored The Dark Young Man because it was written in Yiddish. On top of that, Jewish writers, seeing the popularity of Dinezon's Yiddish novel, to paraphrase Mendele Mocher's Forum, followed each other head over heels, one after another, into the book-writing business. Numerous authors jumped onto the bandwagon and began churning out imitative works of an inferior quality. Dinezon writes, I felt guilty for the whole flood of vapid and dismal novels drowning the Jewish reader. I couldn't stop writing, but it didn't cost me effort or mental strain not to publish the finished work. Dinezon will not publish another major literary work for 13 years. Now, the next 6 or 7 years of Dinezon's life are hard to track. I haven't really been able to nail things down, where he lived or how he made a living. But in 1885, he moves to Warsaw, where his older sister, Fega Kot, and her family are living. In their home, he takes a small attic apartment, which soon becomes a gathering place for members of the Jewish literary community. So Citron describes Dinezon's quarters. One sat there on the only bed because there was no room for chairs in that crumb of a room. But everyone felt very at home there. Dinezon's room had great appeal. Writers liked nestling together there. This was due to Dinezon's good character, his diamond-like nature, his empathy, and his willingness to help without waiting to be asked. He treated each writer as a dear friend, as a brother. In 1889, with the strong encouragement of I.L. Peretz, Dinezon ends his 13-year hiatus and publishes at his own expense the novel Even Negev oder A Stein in Weg, Stumbling Block or A Stone in the Road. 2 years later, Dinezon contributes his newest novel, Herschele, to the first volume of the Yiddische Bibliothek, the Jewish Library, a Yiddish anthology he publishes in partnership with Peretz. Like The Dark Young Man, this is an emotional and bittersweet romance, but the characters are more three-dimensional and the story less heavy-handed. The novel is often praised as one of Dinezon's best, and it presents a wonderful scenes about Passover at the turn of the 20th century. Dinezon will continue to write novels up until 1905, first publishing them in various Yiddish newspapers and journals before releasing them in book form. These include Two Mothers, about an orphan boy who can't marry his soulmate because he has been taken in and raised by her mother. Alter, about an orphan schoolteacher who must marry or lose his deceased father's students. Frolic and His House, about an old man who resists his children's request to abandon his run-down home and come live with them in America. And The Crisis, about the impact of modernity on the lives of old-fashioned Jewish merchants. Now, in 1909, the literary community of Warsaw held a great celebration to honor Sholem Aleichem on his 25th Jubilee as a writer. Unfortunately, Sholem Aleichem was ill and recovering in Italy, so his wife, Olga, attended in his place. And she returns to her husband bearing gifts, a special blend of tea, some fine writing paper, and most importantly, copyrights. Dinezon had spearheaded a committee to buy back Sholem Aleicham's copyrights from the publishers, from the original publishers. This gave Sholem Aleichem the ability to republish and earn income from his prior literary works. This is pretty interesting. I was thinking about this in relationship to this wonderful production of Fiddler on the Roof you've seen in Yiddish, right? I'm sure many of you have seen it. So we realize that production, right, began with Sholem Aleicham's original stories. Then some of those were translated and turned into a play by Arnold Pearl. You still see Arnold Pearl's name on that poster about the play, right? And then Arnold Pearl writes a play called Tevye's Daughters, and then that ultimately they use some of those stories, and those stories become Fiddler on the Roof, right? And then another writer comes along and rewrites it in Yiddish, and you have the fourth generation or iteration of Sholem Aleicham's stories. Well, what if those Tevye stories were part of the package of copyrights that Dinezon helped Sholem Aleichem acquire? What if they weren't, and he wasn't able to publish those stories again, or his wife wasn't able to publish them later in her life? We might never have had that wonderful production. At any rate, Sholem Aleichem writes a thank you note dated March 27th, 1909. Beloved, good, and dear Jacob Dinezon, do you recognize this paper? It's yours. Not that there isn't any writing paper in Italy, but it isn't like Dinezon's paper. Why, there is tea here too. You can get anything for money. Dinezon's tea, however, has a taste all its own. We drank Dinezon's tea yesterday with all the children seated around the table. Little Tamra was there too. She doesn't know Uncle Dinezon yet, but she will soon learn that there is somewhere in the city of Warsaw a tiny, spare, graying little man with tiny but spotlessly clean little hands, with a little graying beard. It once was reddish, and with kindly eyes, forever smiling, even when moist with tears. He smokes little cigarettes rolled with his own little fingers. He drinks his own tea made in his own little teapot. And he always sits on the same chair at the table, where he keeps hidden in an unusually organized fashion other people's secrets, other people's troubles and other people's anguish, which he holds so close to his uncommonly big heart. And this good uncle is called Uncle Dinezon. Isn't that beautiful? I think it was Ezra Glinter who said, if Jacob Dinezon hadn't existed, Sholem Aleichem would have created him. The final 5 years of Jacob Dinezon's life was a whirlwind of disruption and difficulty. Although he remained engaged with the Yiddish literary community, even serving on the board of the Yiddish Writers and Journalists Association, the outbreak of the First World War in 1914 forced him into a completely new career, community benefactor. As battles raged on the border between Germany and Russia, Jewish refugees poured into Warsaw, among them orphans and children separated from their parents. Collaborating with parents, Dinezon throws himself into the establishment of an orphanage and school. Day and night he works tirelessly to raise funds to feed, clothe, and care for the war-ravaged children. You can barely see him in the corner up there in the right-hand corner of that schoolroom. Then tragedy strikes close to home. Peretz dies of a heart attack during Passover 1915. As mourners stream through the Peretz apartment, Dinezon sits beside his friend, never leaving the body for a moment. Nearly all of Jewish Warsaw joins the procession that carries Peretz's casket to the cemetery on Okapova Street. According to one Yiddish newspaper, in some places the crowd reached up to 150,000. Dinezon pours out his grief to the revered poet, playwright, author, and ethnographer S. Onsky. Dearest and most beloved, and after our blessed Peretz, my one and only remaining friend. I'm ashamed that I continue to live, but my life would truly be a disgrace if I were as bad as all the others who believe as they do that Peretz, both of ours, and especially my Peretz, really died. When I stand next to the grave, he is alive at my side and reads along with me the little temporary grave marker. And as a hot tear seeps from my eye, he notices it right away, and with his reassuring smile laughs at me for having a woman's tendency to weep so easily. "Nu, why are you crying?" he asks. "What do these words on the grave marker tell you?" "Silly man, they were written by your grave digger, who doesn't know anything about life and death. For him, perhaps, Isaac Leibush Peretz has died. For you, however, he is still alive." In May of 1916, more bad news arrives. The Heint reports that Sholem Aleichem has died in New York City. A year later, Sholem Abramovich passes away in Odessa. Yet Dinezon persists, throwing himself ever deeper into his work for children and the secular Yiddish schools movement. Look carefully. It's hard to see, but in the midst of those beautiful, precious young girls, Jacob Dinezon sits. I only wish I had a photograph to depict these words by the educator and author C.S. Kasdan. He often played with the children, entering their circle, taking them by the hand, and dancing with them. He remembered the child that was sad the day before, and if today the child was lively again, it was for him truly a celebration. In the summer of 1919, Dinezon's health began to deteriorate, and by the afternoon of August 29th, it was clear that he had very little time remaining. A reporter for the Heint described the scene at Dinezon's bedside. At 3 o'clock, the patient was resting comfortably, but by his difficult breathing, it was clear that the last moments were coming. The friends and admirers who had come to visit did not leave, but stayed by his bed. At 15 minutes after 5, the patient gave a slight shudder and stopped breathing. His eyes closed, and his face softened and became peaceful. 5 minutes later, Dinezon exhaled his last breath. Because Dinezon died on Shabbos, the Jewish newspapers did not publish the news until Sunday, August 31st, the day of the funeral. So the news of Dinezon's death was spread by word of mouth. When the Yahrzeit did appear on Sunday, it reported on the funeral procession that started at the home of the deceased at Karmelitska 29 and ended with Dinezon's burial in the Jewish cemetery on Okapova Street. Dinezon's final wish was granted, and he was buried beside his friend Eyal Peretz. The author and critic David Frischman described the day. The funeral was underway. 10,000, 30,000, 50,000 people, who knows how many. The streets were overflowing with delegations and organizations from every affiliation and faction. Almost the entire Jewish population of Warsaw. Rain beat down on our heads from a dreary sky, and I was the only one walking close beside the wagon through the mud. Oh, poor quiet man! In your quietude, you did not know that the world was so shrill and making of tumult, that it would also make a tumult of the funeral of such a quiet man. And something else you did not know, that a time would come when a man did not go to the Eastern Wall, but the Eastern Wall would come to him. So here we are in New York City, and honestly I have to pinch myself to see you all here, commemorating the 100th Yahrzeit of the Yiddish author Jacob Dinezon, the name in the middle. It's been an astonishing journey and a humbling one to get to know this man through his own words and through the words of his friends and his critics. To see his photographs alone and with others, and to reflect on his ideas, his values, and his heart. We see Dinezon's heart in his novels and his stories. From his earliest days, he knew that Jews sometimes need to shed tears to soften and console our full and troubled hearts. I love this quote from the author and photographer Alter Kaczynski, who was at Dinezon's bedside and must have been very close to Dinezon at the end of his life. Kaczynski writes, "This frail Dinezon, the soft-hearted one with the feminine soul, earned the true, the most consistent folk credit. He was the true writer of the people. It was not society that read him, but the folk, pious mothers, dreamy daughters, bearded fathers. Entire families read him. Two authentic folk writers were ours, Dinezon and Shalom Aleichem. It does not occur to anyone to put these two writers on the same level. Yet it is so. Dinezon is the tearful one, and Shalom Aleichem is the clown. You will cry as naturally reading Dinezon as you will naturally burst into laughter reading Shalom Aleichem." But in the final analysis, as I reflect back over the past 16 years, what stands out to me is Jacob Dinezon's character, his integrity and honor, his modesty and compassion, his courage, and unfailing loyalty to his friends and the Jewish people. In his life and in his writings, Jacob Dinezon was the embodiment of a mensch, a role model during his lifetime, and a role model for us today. That's why it's important to remember there was a Jacob Dinezon in the world. Thank you. Thank you.